Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all their support. There's even a brand new Brigadier General tier where you can get a shout out on a Commander's Quarters episode that's dedicated to you. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in for the Commander's Quarters studio. Welcome to the show. So as I've alluded to, or maybe even just outright mentioned on a few episodes, I'm a big fan of anime. And one of my personal favorites, like many anime fans out there, is Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. Now, if you've ever seen that anime series, you would definitely know about the concept of equivalent exchange. Basically, the concept is simple: something cannot be created from nothing. To obtain something, you must give up something of equal value. And recently, I was inspired to build a deck completely around this concept. But spoiler alert, much like with the Elrics, it didn't go as planned. Because what I created was an absolute monster, and I am warning you right now, do not play this deck. And no, I'm not joking. This deck in its current form, you should not play. So I'm going to take you through the initial build of this deck, talk about why you should not play it in its current form, and I'll talk about the adjustments that I'm going to be trying to make to this deck to actually make it so that I can play it without, upsetting everyone else at the table and, probably losing some friends. And also, this is one of the decks that I mentioned on my new personal Commander decks episode, and if you haven't seen that episode yet, make sure you check it out to see what exciting decks I'm, loving to play right now. But with all that said, hopefully you learn from my mistakes on this one, and let's jump into it. So, when picking the commander for this deck, I ended up actually landing on Pramikon Sky Rampart. And Pramikon is actually kind of the perfect choice for this. It's got the actual colors that I want for the deck, and Pramikon is not all that threatening of a commander. It's a 1/5 wall with flying and defender that costs blue, red, white, and it says when it enters the battlefield, choose left or right. Each player may attack only the nearest opponent in the chosen direction, and planeswalkers controlled by that opponent. Basically, hey, we're all attacking this way, or we're all attacking that way. That's basically all this commander does. So yeah, it's not all that threatening, it's cheap to cast, and you can actually, help save yourself from the giant army on your left or right, and make sure that they're going in a different direction if they are going to be attacking. And on top of all this, Pramikon is actually the perfect commander for this deck because, we don't care if someone else actually gets Pramikon. Now, what exactly do I mean by that? Well, like I said earlier, the concept for this deck is built around equivalent exchange. Meaning for this deck's purposes, I'm going to be giving my opponent something, and they're going to be giving me something back. So if I happen to give an opponent Pramikon, that basically doesn't change anything. The direction is still already chosen for whatever I picked, left or right. That doesn't change if I give it to someone else. And Pramikon isn't going to be attacking me because, it has Defender. Now, yes, that player has a blocker. Good for them. But I've got plenty of ways to actually get Pramikon back if I need to. And ways to actually change the direction if I need to. So, yeah, giving Pramikon away to someone else is actually not really all that big of a deal. But the thing that I get back in exchange for Pramikon, or for another one of my creatures, that can be really impactful. Now, let's dig a bit further into this concept of equivalent exchange and talk about what cards this deck was built around and built with in mind. And actually, with those cards, every single one of them, including the commander, was less than $1 at the time of this build, so yeah, this was a budget-friendly deck. But even a budget-friendly deck like this one can of course be a monster in disguise, so with all that said, let's jump into it. So again, the concept for this deck is built around equivalent exchange, so I'm going to be utilizing exchange cards like Ledger Domain, Switcheroo, and Shrewd Negotiation. So these cards are actually exchange cards where you trade one thing for another thing, and yeah, they're not exactly theft cards because you are giving something up. Or at least that's what I told myself when I built the deck, and yeah, in practice it might be slightly different, so we'll get to that here in a bit. And yeah, these cards see play in basically no decks, and I thought it'd be fun to highlight them in a deck like this one. Regardless, Ledger Domain's Oracle text reads, exchange control of target artifact or creature and another target permanent that shares one of those types with it. Switcheroo says exchange control of 2 target creatures, and Shrewd Negotiation says exchange control of target artifact you control and target artifact or creature you don't control. So again, equivalent exchange. I give you one thing, you give me one thing back. I give you Pramicon Sky Rampart, and you give me, well, the best creature on the board. Okay, fine, so it's not exactly equivalent. Actually is 1 card for 1 card, but yeah, I'm trading away pretty much not, all that worthwhile of a creature to get something that's much more impactful. And maybe that should have been the red flag for this deck before I even built it and played it, but I, of course, kept going. So I also utilize cards like Role Reversal and Shifting Loyalties. Each of these do the exact same thing. They're going to exchange control of 2 target permanents that share a permanent type. So actually, with these, we don't even have to be part of the actual exchange. We don't need to actually control one of the permanents, though most of the time we are going to be the ones that we're exchanging something with. And most of the time we're going to be exchanging is a creature like Pramicon, but yeah, we could exchange an artifact or an enchantment or even a land. Regardless, I'm not done with exchange cards just yet, so let's talk about Juxtapose, Order of Succession, and Visions of Duplicity. Juxtapose is a really old card from Legends, and its Oracle text reads, you and target player exchange control of the creature you control the highest mana value, then exchange control of artifacts the same way. If 2 or more permanents a player controls are tied for the highest, their controller chooses one of them. Yeah, there's a reason you don't see this card very often in Commander. It's quite a weird one, but incredibly impactful in this deck. And then Order of Succession says choose left or right, starting with you and proceeding in the chosen direction. Each player chooses a creature controlled by the next player in that direction. Each player gains control of the creature he or she chose. So this one actually has everyone essentially exchange creatures, but in a circular fashion. And then Visions of Duplicity says exchange control of 2 target creatures you don't control, and it's got flashback. So this one we actually again aren't part of the actual exchange. We're not getting either of the creatures, but we can, maybe swap 2 people's commanders. So yeah, their decks don't function nearly as well as they would if they actually had their commander. Or, we can make a deal with one player to give them the best creature on the board in exchange for their worst creature if, they'd never use that card against us or, other deals, etc, etc, etc. So with my initial build, I also envision some politicking happening in this deck as well. But next up, let's move on to some other exchange cards with Eyes Everywhere, Puka's Mischief, and Djinn of Infinite Deceits. Eyes Everywhere says at the beginning of your upkeep, scry 1, so that's just some nice additional value, and it also has, of course, pay 5 in a blue, exchange control of it, and target non-land permanent, activates ability only anytime you cast a sorcery. So this on the battlefield actually kind of is a warning to your opponents not to mess with you, because if they do, well, you're going to take their best thing and give them this. And if they don't have access to blue mana, well, they can't just reactivate this to get whatever we took from them back. But perhaps an even better enchantment in this deck is Puka's Mischief, which says at the beginning of your upkeep, you may exchange control of target non-land permanent you control and target non-land permanent opponent controls with an equal or lesser converted mana cost. And yeah, we do have some higher converted mana cost things in this deck that we can exchange around. And then Djinn of Infinite Deceits is a 2/7 flyer that has tap exchange control of 2 target non-legendary creatures. You can't activate its ability during combat. So with this, we can't exchange Pramicon, but believe me, we've got a lot of other creatures that we do want to exchange. And speaking of exchanging creatures, how about Chrome Shell Crab? It's a morph creature, and when it's turned face up, we can exchange control of target creature we control and target creature an opponent controls. So that player might either get, a wall or a crab, and, maybe we get an Eldrazi. Moving on, Spawn Broker has when it comes into play, you may exchange control of target creature you control and target creature with power less than or equal to that creature's power and opponent controls. Next up, Vidalcan Plotter has when it enters the battlefield, exchange control of target land you control and target land and opponent controls. So yeah, here, take this plains and I'll take your command tower, or Gaia's Cradle or whatnot. But we even have somewhat of a counterspell that can help us with exchange with sudden substitution. It's got split second. It says exchange control of target non-creature spell and target creature, then the spell's controller may choose new targets for it. So we can use this in multiple ways, and yeah, this can help us out in a lot of situations. And speaking of utilizing our opponent's spells as our own, how about Insidious Will? It says choose one counter target spell, you may choose new targets for target spell, or copy target insert sorcery spell, you may choose new targets for the copy. And finally, Izzet Charm can actually be a good counter spell for us as well, or a damage spell, or a draw spell. It says choose one counter target non-creature spell its controller pays 2, Izzet Charm deals 2 damage to target creature, or draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards. And speaking of options, outside of Pramicon, we want to have some other creatures that we're, well, willing to exchange. And some incredible ones in this deck are cards like Izzet Chronarch, Mnemonic Wall, Salvager of Secrets, Shipwreck Dowser, Ardent Elementalist, and Archaeomancer. Each of these creatures essentially does the exact same thing, and they are fantastic in this deck. They basically have, when they enter the battlefield, return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. So with these creatures, we get a valuable ETB that can get us back an exchange card or something else that we'll talk about here in a bit. And after they've done their job and, gotten you back that exchange card, well, you just say, hey, Archaeomancer, I know, that we've had a lot of good times. You've been on my battlefield for a little bit, but you know what? I'm sorry, that player over there has a Blightsteel Colossus, so I'm going to actually give you to them, and I'm going to take Blightsteel, okay? Don't worry, Archaeomancer will understand, and you know what? Archaeomancer very well might be back in play under your control very shortly, but we'll get to that here in a bit. Before we get to that, we have to talk about the Golden Pig of this deck, which is the #1 card out of our 99. And the Golden Pig for this deck is Scholar of the Ages. Scholar of the Ages is a 3/3 human wizard for 5 blue, which yes is a lot of mana, but believe me, this is well worth it because she has, when she enters the battlefield, return up to 2 target instant and or sorcery cards from your graveyard to your hand. Basically, a double Archaeomancer getting you back 2 things instead of 1, and yeah, this thing can do an incredible amount of work in this deck. So yeah, get back some exchange cards or get back a different kind of card, which again, I keep mentioning, I'm very sorry, I will talk about here in a bit, but I don't want to spoil it just yet. Just know that giving away Scholar of the Ages again is not really all that bad of a thing. You give it to an opponent after Scholar of the Ages has done its work and gotten you back your cards, and again, you very well might be seeing Scholar of the Ages again on your side of the board very soon. So yeah, the amount of value that this can provide you throughout the game is absolutely incredible, and that's why it's the Golden Pig. Regardless, we also have some other creatures that we can dish out thanks to cards like Metallurgic Summonings, Goblin Assault, and Salt Skitter. Metallurgic Summoning says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, create an XX colors construct artifact creature token, where X that spell's mana value. And once you've got 6 or more artifacts, you can pay 3 blue and exile this to return all instant and or sorcery cards from your graveyard to your hand. So this can make us a lot of creature tokens that we can exchange and get us a ton of spells back. And speaking of exchanging creature tokens, Goblin Assault, well, can make us a lot of them as well. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, create a 1/1 red Goblin creature token with haste, and Goblin creatures attack each turn if able. And actually, this card can be really funny if we actually are playing against a Goblin player, because giving it to them, well, that can maybe throw a wrench into their plans if they weren't planning on attacking with all their goblins every turn. Regardless, Salt Skitter very well might be our best exchange target because it says, whenever another creature enters the battlefield, exile Salt Skitter, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So yeah, we exchange this with an opponent, and then the second that another creature comes into play, no matter whose creature it is, this goes away, and then eventually it's going to come back into play under our control. So yeah, you can see how the whole concept of things being equivalent is maybe a little fuzzy. And yeah, just exchanging Salt Skitter over and over again for other creatures can provide a lot of value throughout the game. And speaking of value, let's talk about Double Vision and Swarm Intelligence. Double Vision says, whenever you cast your first instant or sorcery spell each turn, copy that spell. You may choose 2 targets for the copy. And then Swarm Intelligence does the exact same thing, but without that first spell limitation, so it counts all of our instants and sorceries. Yeah, doubling up on an exchange spell can be incredibly impactful for this deck. Or, another type of spell that I have mentioned a few times, and we'll get to right now. And those would be very specifically worded blink spells like Long Road Home, Otherworldly Journey, Hallowed Respite, Flicker of Fate, and Turn to Mist. And the wording that we're essentially looking for is this, which we can see on Turn to Mist. Exile target creature. Return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So these blink cards can exile any creature on the board no matter who controls them. And then that creature is going to come back into play under its owner's control. So say that we give something away like, Pramicon or like our Golden Pig. Well, another player is going to control them. We cast one of these blink spells to exile that creature, and then it's going to come back into play under our control. With Pramicon, we get to choose another direction if we actually want to, so yeah, blinking it was a good thing, and we basically just, took that creature back that we had given to someone else. And of course, with our Golden Pig, well, we get that ETB again, so we get 2 instants and or sorceries back from our graveyard. And one of them is probably going to be the very blink spell that we just used to get that creature back, and probably an exchange spell. So then we can do it again, and again, and again. So again, that exchange that we made might seem just a bit more one-sided at this point. Since we essentially got both creatures, and yeah, that player ended up with neither of them. And of course, we've got other cards with similar effects like Mist Metal Witch, Gale Powder Mage, and Voyager Staff. Mist Metal Witch has pay 2 white-blue, exile target creature, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control to begin the next end step. So basically like a turn to mist, but on a creature, so yeah, this is a repeatable effect. And then Gale Powder Mage essentially does the exact same thing, but on an attack trigger, and Voyager Staff essentially does the exact same thing, but on an artifact that we have to pay 2 to sacrifice to do so. And finally, Cloud Shift is actually a different one that I decided to include in this deck as well. It says exile target creature you control, then return the card to the battlefield under your control. So Cloud Shift actually can't get back a creature that we gave away. Again, we can only exile a creature that we control, but we can return that card back to the battlefield under our control. Again, it doesn't matter if we actually own the card or not. So this can actually be a way to protect one of the creatures that we actually took from an opponent, or we can just utilize this to use and abuse an ETB. And speaking of a powerful enter the battlefield trigger, next up, let's talk about a card like Scholarship Sponsor, which can be incredible in this deck. It's a 3/3 that says, when it enters the battlefield, each player who controls fewer lands than the player who controls the most lands searches their library for a number of basic land cards less than or equal to the difference, puts those cards on the battlefield, tap, then shuffles. Again, this deck does not have access to green, so yeah, our land ramp options are kind of non-existent. Chances are another player, though, is going to be playing green and is going to be ramping with lands, so yeah, this can catch everyone else up, including ourselves. And again, we can use this to catch up multiple times because we have those blink spells in our deck, so yeah, exchanging this with another creature, giving this to someone else is not all that big of a deal, and yeah, if we need to get it back, we can, and we can get all those lands again. Next up, Pen of Prosperity is kind of like a political kind of ramp card, or at least it is in a lot of decks. So yeah, it can be used in a political way for this deck, but we can also use it in a somewhat sneaky way. It enters the battlefield under the control of an opponent of our choice, and by paying 2 and tapping it, we can draw a card, then we put a land card from our hand onto the battlefield. Pen of Prosperity's owner draws a card, then that player puts a land card from their hand on the battlefield. So yes, it is possible to politic with this deck, well, until you've annoyed all the other players at the table, and then they probably won't politic with you at all. But that actually doesn't even matter with Pen of Prosperity, and actually, this card is actually better when you don't politic. Because if you can exchange control of an artifact that you control in Pen of Prosperity, which again, you give an opponent when it comes into play, once you get Pen of Prosperity under your control, this card is incredible. Because once you get this is basically pay 2, tap, draw 2 cards, and put 2 lands into play. So yeah, who needs politics? And of course, we're running some more traditional ramp spells as well, like Izzet Signet, Boros Signet, Azorius Signet, Sky Diamond, Marble Diamond, Fire Diamond, Prismatic Lens, Talisman of Creativity, and the Celestus. And when it comes to card draw, we've got some cards that can really work well in this deck, like Whirlwind of Thought, Muldrifter, and Cloud Blazer. Whirlwind of Thought says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, draw a card, and yeah, this deck has plenty of non-creature spells. And then Muldrifter and Cloud Blazer both have fantastic ETBs. They're both going to draw us 2 cards, and Cloud Blazer is also going to gain us 2 life. So if we need to blink these for some value, again, we can. But we've also got some regular draw spells as well, like Factor Fiction, Rain of Revelation, Epiphany of the Drowned Yard, Read the Runes, and Commander's Insight. And of course, outside of exchanging things, we also have some other ways to control the board with things like Crush Contraband, Rip Apart, Aether Gale, Cleansing Nova, Time Wipe, and Martial Coup. But now that we've gone through every single non-lane card in this deck, let's actually talk about some other cards that I'm actually considering for this deck. I really don't want to just entirely get rid of the concept of this deck and just take it entirely apart, but I do want to change some things up so, well, I can still play it without losing friends. Again, in its current form, I am warning you, please, please, please do not play this deck. Or I guess I should say, unless your playgroup is completely fine with playing against this kind of deck, and actually, if you're playing against the right kind of decks. Again, this deck heavily depends on other players having valuable creatures that can help you finish out the game. And if those players don't have those kinds of threats on the board or in their decks, well, it's going to be really hard for you to finish out the game, but you can find a lot of ways to actually control the board very well, and then the game can end up taking, oh, I don't know, 26 or 27 turns, like the one time that I've played this deck so far. So yeah, again, I am urging you, in its current form, do not play this deck. But let's talk about some adjustments that I do want to make with this deck to actually make it so, well, the game doesn't take 27 turns and you can find ways to quickly finish players off. Now, my apologies, but I haven't finalized an actual new list for this deck, but I have finalized some cards that I am definitely considering adding in. So I am most definitely considering cards like Transmogrify, Blessed Reincarnation, and Reweave. Transmogrify says exile target creature. That creature's controller reveals cards to the top of their library until they reveal a creature card. That player puts that card onto the battlefield, then shovels the rest into their library. Blessed Reincarnation essentially does the exact same thing, but only for a creature an opponent controls, and it's got Rebound. And then Reweave says, target permanent's controller sacrifices it, that player reveals cards in the top of their library until they reveal a card that shares a card type with the sacrifice permanent, then that player puts that card into play and shelves their library. Basically, the idea is this. We can essentially force a player to get a big threat into play. By getting rid of one of their creatures, we can get an even bigger creature off the top of their library into play. Then we exchange control to get that threat under our control. Again, keep in mind that you're still going to have to pick and choose which decks you actually play this deck against, because if you're playing against decks that don't, well, have big threats, then this doesn't work. But actually, this helps alleviate another problem that this deck ran into, the time that I played it, and it lasted whatever, 25, 26, whatever turns, is that at a certain point, once you've got things under control, players are going to stop playing their threats because you're just going to take them, so then the game kind of stalls out. So this can force the game to not stall by, again, forcing those creatures into play. Regardless, I'm also considering cards like Boldweir Heavyweights and Guild Feud. Boldweir Heavyweights is an 8/8 trampling giant warrior for just 2 red, so yeah, this is a massive creature, but it has a major downside, well, at least for a lot of decks. Because when it comes into play, each opponent may search their library for a creature card and put it onto the battlefield, then each player searches the library this way, shuffles it. So yeah, if one of those players is getting a giant threat, the other players might very well feel like they have to get one of their big threats, and then you've got some great exchange targets on the board. Next up, Guild Feud says at the beginning of your upkeep, target opponent reveals the top 3 cards of their library, may put a creature card from among them onto the battlefield, and puts the rest in their graveyard. You do the same with the top 3 cards of your library. If 2 creatures are on the battlefield this way, those creatures fight each other. So this can get you some free creatures into play, and again, you've got a lot of creatures that have some great ETBs, so that's some free value there. And of course, this can essentially make it so an opponent has to choose whether they want to get that creature off the top of their library into play, or not. And again, that very well might be a creature that you're going to equivalent exchange. Next up, we can actually force cards out of hands as well with Wild Evocation. It says at the beginning of each player's upkeep, the player reveals a card at random from their hand. If it's a land card, the player puts on the battlefield. Otherwise, the player casts it without paying its mana cost to Fable. So yeah, that player doesn't even get the option at this point. They have to cast the card. So again, if they're trying to just hold back a massive creature in their hand because they don't want us to actually take it, well, too bad. And then Metamorphose says, put target permanent opponent controls on top of its owner's library. That player may put an artifact, creature, enchantment, or land card from their hand into play. So with this, we give the player the option, and they just might take it. And speaking of taking things, of course, Mass Mutiny is always an option. For each opponent, gain control of up to 1 target creature the player controls. Untap those creatures to gain haste until end of turn. So even just temporarily gaining control of our opponent's creatures can help us finish the game. Next up though, how about Stolen Goods, which says target opponent exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card. Until end of turn, you may cast the card without paying its mana cost. And then Curse of Unbinding says enchant player. At the beginning of enchant player's upkeep, that player reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a creature card. Put that card onto the battlefield under your control. That player puts the rest cards in their graveyard. So these two essentially get us something random off the top of an opponent's library. And yeah, no, there's not any equivalent exchange involved, but it's a way to help finish players off if we hit something big. And speaking of hitting something big, Inevitable Betrayal can also help as well. It's got spend 3 for 1 blue, and it says search target opponent's library for a creature card, put that card onto the battlefield under your control, then that player shuffles. So if they're not willing to actually play their big creatures, well, we can just search the library, get their biggest creature, and finish them off with that. But yeah, again, I have not finalized this new list. I'm not sure if it's even going to work in a way that, well, doesn't lose me my friends. So again, I urge you, please, please, please think twice before actually playing the original version of this deck. Like the Elrics, I didn't know exactly what I was getting myself into with equivalent exchange. And with that, the show has come to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thank you again, and have a good one.